In a federal courtroom in Paducah, Kentucky in the spring of 1908, a judge told a jury that he was ashamed of his own memory. 28 men had been sued. Each had brought 2 witnesses, and every one of them could say exactly where that man had been, on one particular night at one particular hour, 10 months before anybody filed anything. In 4 counties of western Kentucky, thousands of men had spent 2 years riding at night in masks. Whole towns had been taken. Warehouses had burned to the ground with the population watching from their windows. And in those same counties, in those same 2 years, the record of who did it is almost perfectly blank. Almost. There is one place the names got written down, and it is not an indictment. They called it the Black Patch, a stretch of country across western Kentucky and into north-middle Tennessee, named for what comes out of the ground. Dark-fired tobacco, cured over smoldering hardwood until the leaf turns almost black. Most of it went overseas, and the buyers who mattered were not a market. They were a short list: the American Tobacco Company, the American Snuff Company, Britain's Imperial Tobacco, and the Italian Regi. By 1904, a pound of dark tobacco sold for less than it cost to raise. So the growers organized. The Planters Protective Association, everyone called it the pool, asked its members to hold the crop back until the price came up. A pool only works if everybody is in it, and not everybody was. Some men needed the cash that season. Some had a buyer they liked. Some just wouldn't. Beginning in 1905, things happened to those men at night. Plant beds scraped bare. Barns burned. Men pulled out of their houses and whipped in their own yards. They had a name for themselves. Years later, a lawyer put it into a federal complaint in plain legal English: a secret criminal society, generally called and known as the Silent Brigade or Night Riders. On the 1st of December, 1906, they stopped visiting farms one at a time. Princeton, Kentucky, county seat of Caldwell County. Shortly after midnight, armed men came in from every direction, single riders, groups of 5 and 6, on horseback, walking, driving. They took the town and held it an hour, poured coal oil inside 2 big tobacco stemmeries and lit them from within. 3 houses burned with them because nobody was allowed out to fight the fire. By morning, Princeton had a burned-out center and one other thing: no clue to the identity of the masked raiders. In a town of 3,000 people, where hundreds of men had just marched through the streets for an hour. Except that wasn't quite true, and everybody involved knew it wasn't. A Caldwell County grand jury began looking into the Princeton raid. Among the people it wanted to hear from was Mary Hollowell, who lived with her husband Robert near Lamasco. On the 2nd of May, 1907, an armed mob came to that house. They whipped Robert Hollowell. They knocked his wife down and shot her. They abused their son Price, who was 12, and they drove the family out of the state. The reason, as it was later stated in federal court and printed on a Kentucky front page, was to prevent their testifying before the grand jury about the raid on Princeton. Hold on to that. The mob that could not be identified came back 6 months later to make certain the witnesses could not identify it. 7 months after that, they took the largest city in the region, Hopkinsville, Kentucky. 10,000 people. 3 railroads, banks, a courthouse, a police force, a fire department. About 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, the 7th of December, 1907, an armed and masked body of men captured it. That is not a figure of speech, and it isn't my phrasing. It is the phrasing of the town's own newspaper 4 days later. They left their horses at a rail crossing 2 miles out and came in on foot along the tracks, marching in a solid phalanx, a piece of white cloth pinned to every shoulder. 6 squads. 1 stopped at the telephone exchange, 1 at the fire department, 2 went on to the depot. 3 men held the West 7th Street Bridge. The firemen were held in their own station and told the order was to shoot every living thing, man or horse, that tried to leave the building. Nobody tried for half an hour. At the home telephone office, an operator named Maud Brown turned in the fire alarm. The man who answered told her they were captives. She turned out the lights, went upstairs to a back room, and was not molested. At the other exchange, 8 of them brought the 2 girl operators down onto the street and stood them at the curb. And there, in the middle of it, a leader told a man who was swearing to cut out that cursing and remember he was in the presence of ladies. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Not the fires, the manners. 3 tobacco warehouses were burned. 1 belonging to the Italian Regi, 1 independent, and 1 holding Association Tobacco, their own side's crop, because it happened to be stored in the wrong house. The bank windows were shot out. So were the courthouse windows, and so were the windows of the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, which had been printing editorials against the night riders. At 9th and Main, the squads formed up, and it took a few minutes to call the roll. By numbers, not by name. Whatever else the Silent Brigade was, it had thought carefully about never saying a member's name out loud in a public street. How many were there? The Associated Press wire said 300. 2 men from Paducah who spent the hour at the Hotel Latham said 500, in long black robes and white masks under a white cowl. The town's own paper counted 6 squads of between 6 and 30. Those accounts cannot all be true. Nobody ever reconciled them, because reconciling them would have required somebody to be counted. The governor ordered troops into Hopkinsville that same night. The reason the officials gave is worth hearing exactly. They believed soldiers would let them secure witnesses who could positively identify members of the mob. That was December. Now go forward to the 23rd of April, 1908, and look at one front page of the Paducah Evening Sun. On the left of that page, a federal jury is being handed the Hallowell case. On the right of the same page, a county grand jury is going home. No indictments for night rider warnings found. That grand jury had sat more than 3 weeks. It returned about 14 indictments, and none were for night riding. Several night rider cases were investigated, the paper says, and in not a single one was sufficient evidence adduced to warrant an indictment. In many counties in the Black Patch, it has been impossible to indict night riders because the organization is so strong night riders get on the grand juries, and many county officials are either in sympathy with them or intimidated by them. Which brings us back to Robert and Mary Hallowell, run out of Kentucky a year earlier for being willing to talk. They could not get anyone indicted, so they sued. Robert for $50,000, Mary for $50,000, and their son Price for $25,000 more. They brought their case in the federal court at Paducah, and that is the whole trick. A federal court draws its jurors from the entire western district of Kentucky. It does not have to seat 12 men out of Caldwell County. They named 28 defendants. Among them was Robert Hallowell's own brother, John E. Hallowell, and his brother's wife, and Robert's cousin, John W. Hallowell, who was chairman of the Caldwell County Tobacco Association. The Cairo Bulletin across the river in Illinois put a subhead on it. Families were split. The first trial produced no verdict, so Judge Evans said something remarkable for a sitting federal judge. He said that for the retrial he would go and get a jury out of a part of the state that did not grow tobacco, made up of men who belonged to no association at all. He got retired businessmen from Louisville and farmers out of Bullitt County, men with no crop in the pool and no neighbor to face on Monday. The second trial ran a week, 28 alibis again. The next morning the jury called for pen, ink, and paper. 45 minutes later, they came back. $35,000 for Robert Hollowell, the largest verdict ever returned in Paducah in any court. That is somewhere near $1 million today, assessed against 28 farmers, most of whom owned land, and every one of whom now had a federal judgment standing against it. The Cairo Bulletin called it the death knell of the night riders. That was, at best, early. What the verdict actually did was show every other victim in the black patch where the door was. 8 months later, a man named A.H. Carden filed suit in that same federal court. His warehouse at View in Crittenden County had been burned the previous February. He asked for $16,400. His was the 8th such suit filed there in 12 months. And this is what I wanted to show you from the beginning. In order to sue them, Carden had to name them. William Neal, Charles Blue, Charles Smith, Hoke Prince, George Snaden, William Sims, Dr. David A. Amos, Thomas Amos, J. E. Hollowell, John W. Hollowell, Dixie Satterfield, Fred Dara, C. R. Bannister, L. G. Hopper, Sam Cash, Milton Oliver. It runs on like that for most of a newspaper column. Roughly 90 men, printed in a weekly paper in Arlington, Kentucky, where a fair number of their neighbors read it over breakfast. And the paper noted something about that list. Nearly every defendant in Carden's suit had been either a defendant or an alibi witness in the Hollowell case. The deputy marshal serving all those summonses was Elwood Neal. The paper reports, without any comment at all, that Neal now knew most of them by sight and was having less difficulty finding them. And when Carden's lawyer had to describe in a pleading what this organization was for, he set down 3 purposes: to compel every man who grew, handled, or owned dark tobacco to join the association and pool his crop, to inflict condign punishment on anyone who refused, and third, to defeat the purpose of the courts of justice in those counties, and corruptly to influence the grand and petit jurors impaneled there, and so procure the release of any member from trial for the crimes he had committed. That is not a historian's theory about why nobody was indicted. That is the plaintiff's own allegation. The jury tampering was not a side effect of the organization. It was one of its objects. The suits worked, roughly the way lawsuits do. Several settled out of court. Night riding in the black patch thinned out over the next 2 years and stopped. But not right away. Turn to the same page of the same paper that reported Carden's suit and read one column over. A man at the Star Line Works in Lyon County had received a letter threatening death to himself, his son, and 5 neighbors. It read, "Be prepared for death, for we will get you most any time." It was not signed. The paper observed that the 7 men named in it all belonged to the Law and Order League. The record holds a city of 10,000 taken and burned by men who called their roll by number. It holds a family whipped and shot and driven out of Kentucky for being willing to testify. It holds a state grand jury adjourning with nothing, and a federal jury of strangers taking 45 minutes. And it holds about 90 names, printed in a weekly paper under a dollar figure, because the only way to get those names into a public record was to put a price on what had been done to you and hand it to a federal judge. Nobody in Hopkinsville was ever tried for the night of December 7th. If your people farmed in Christian, Caldwell, Lyon, Crittenden, or Trigg County in those years, they were on one side of this or the other, and plenty of families were on both. What did they tell you about it?